Hello to all of you, and thank you for joining this webinar. We will be talking about creativity today, and moreover about how constraints and obstacles can stimulate creativity. And when it comes to creativity, people say that you have to think out of the box and that the sky is the limit. Well, both expressions inspired me for the title of this webinar, which is at the meantime the title of my book, When the Box is the Limit. A little side note before we start: as I'm hosting and presenting this webinar at the same time, it will be difficult for me to select and answer your questions, which you might pose during this webinar, but please don't hold back. Just pose your questions and remarks during the webinar, and we'll get back to you via email in a couple of days with hopefully the answers to most of your questions. But first, let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Walter van der Velde, or Walter van der Velde when it's pronounced in English. And I started my career more than 30 years ago when, in 1988, I began working as a freelance graphic designer and copywriter for international advertising agencies in Brussels. 5 years later, I started my own Markham agency, which grew steadily during the 18 years I ran it together with a business partner. And I left the company in 2011. And instead of selling my own creativity to the client, which I did before, I got fascinated by how to make the client himself more creative. So with the many years of experience in the creative business, supplemented with additional studies in applied creativity, I started giving trainings and consultancy in business creativity, which means stimulating creativity within organizations. Back in 2014, I got the opportunity to share my knowledge with young people when I was asked to be one of the pioneer professors in the study of idea and innovation management at Erasmus University College Brussels, which today has become and still is a half-time job. And last year, I wrote my first book, When the Box is the Limit, published about 5 months ago by Biz Publishers in Amsterdam. And as I mentioned before, the theme of the book is also the topic of this webinar. So what will we be talking about? First of all, of course, creativity. Why is it important? What is it and what is it not? This is the first topic I'd like to discuss with you. And at the meantime, I will try to disprove a few misunderstandings. Secondly, we will go deeper into the subject of this webinar, which is constraints and how they can positively stimulate creativity. And you will see that thinking in alternatives, being one of the basic creativity skills, is often a good start to use constraints as a solution provider. So we dig a little deeper into that skill, looking at multiple examples from different industries. The fourth topic is radical constraints, and we'll see how it often results into radical innovation. And this topic will lead us to the first technique, which is called Tree of Trade. And you notice the words in blue on this page. These are all techniques I developed for several different situations and purposes, and we'll have a look at them in this webinar. After that, we'll talk about frugal innovation, which might not sound very familiar to you right now, but I'll explain all about it later. And based on this type of innovation, we have a great technique, which is called the frugalizer. If we're talking about constraints in business, I think time is often one of the most prominent. So what about time constraints? Do they suppress or stimulate creativity on the work floor? More about that later. And there's a third technique that I'd love to show you. In fact, it's rather a game, which is called the casual constraint contest. We will then take a little trip to the moon and talk about the aborted mission of Apollo 13, which will lead us to the fourth technique, the propeller. And finally, I will also talk about 2 other ways to face an obstacle. And related to that, we'll discuss the last technique called the river. So I hope to wrap up in about something less than an hour. Before we start talking about the relationship between constraints and creativity, I think it's very useful to define what creativity means within the business world, and to focus on the rising importance of creativity in our fast evolving world. This graphic explains a lot. A report from the World Economic Forum about the future of jobs leading companies worldwide were asked which skills will be important in business 5 years from now. So on the left, you see the results from the 2010 survey, so projected on 2015. And on the right-hand side are the results of the 2015 survey, so projected on 2020. So notice that creativity rises from the 10th place to the 3rd place in 5 years' time. And if you look at the first place, you will see that complex problem solving is, in fact, it's one of the main purposes and results of creativity. So this to show that creativity has become one of the highest valued skills worldwide in business. But with creativity comes a lot of misunderstanding, and that's a pity, because if you don't understand a thing very well, chances are that you will never use it properly. And that's the same for creativity. So here are 4 of the most common misunderstandings that I still experience every day when I talk about my job to people who are not familiar with business creativity and innovation. The first one is that people confound creativity with art. So for them, being creative means no less or more than being artistic. But creativity is so much more than music, painting, theater, dance, literature, etc., etc. Because art is only one of the many, many expressions of creativity. When we talk about creativity in a business or functional environment, we think of tackling challenges, improving what exists today, and developing concepts for the future. We talk about designing new products, new services, processes, business models, organizational forms, dealing with conflicts, etc. So, in fact, creativity is the base and the engine of everything that is related to change and innovation. Second one is the persuasion that creative ideas are something like a divine inspiration. And we all know this famous aha moment when an idea suddenly seems to strike us. So that's why many people experience an idea as an unpredictable flash in our head. But this flash is only the result of a whole process that preceded it. And without this prior process of thinking, doubting, wondering, letting go, reconsidering, etc., this aha moment would never strike us. So yes, creativity is a process, even a very controllable one if you get the right skills, and not just a random flash of inspiration. The third misunderstanding is the fact that creativity is often seen as something elitist or exclusive. In other words, you have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, if you don't own that inborn talent, you'll never get any creative ideas. And that's not true, of course. It is true that some people are born with a higher dose of creative potential. Just like there are people gifted with a talent for science or for speaking several languages or for sports. Besides being a native competence, creativity is also like any other competence, a skill you can enhance by training. And when you practice a lot, it will even become a mindset, a way of thinking, of reacting to challenges, of solving problems, of finding new and useful solutions, etc. And the last one is perhaps even the toughest one. Most people are convinced that creativity needs unlimited freedom. The sky is the limit, and we definitely have to get out of that box when we want to be creative. It's an idea that is fed by the romantic vision we have from artists that accept no boundaries, no rules. Well, it's true that really innovative forms of art need a certain level of revolt. And also, in the world of applied creativity, sometimes disruptive innovation demands a largely defined attitude. But I came to the conclusion that a lack of freedom is often too often used, in fact, as an excuse not to be able to be creative. And that's a pity, because boundaries and obstacles can really stimulate the process of creativity. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So let's have a quick look at the world of art. And I think you all know this statue. It's indeed David by Michelangelo, one of the most admired sculptures in the world. And the statue is made from marble. And I don't know if you ever tried to sculpt, and if so, if you ever used marble as a material. Well, I can tell you it's a very hard stone. So it takes a lot of craftsmanship to create something beautiful out of it. And experts all over the world agree that if Michelangelo would have used a soft material like clay, for instance, the sculpture of David would never have been so powerful. So it is just because of the resistance of the difficult material that Michelangelo has succeeded in making such a strong work of art. In other words, he needed that constraint to get the very best out of himself. And there are many other examples from different disciplines in art. Music, for instance. Here you see Igor Stravinsky, a well-known 20th century music composer who claimed that the more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the claims that shackle the spirit, to put it with his own words. Well, Stravinsky was a master in using self-imposed constraints in his music. Sometimes he chose to use only certain pitches in a piece of music, while in other cases he limited the technical demands on the performer, and so on. He also wrote a serenade of which the different pieces were exactly 3 minutes long, because the records at that time couldn't contain more than 3 minutes of music. And I'm sure most of you never heard of this man. His name is Koji Kondo, but I'm also sure that most of you are familiar with his music. So let me play a little tune for you. I hope some of you have recognized it. So indeed, Koji Kondo is the composer of the Mario Brothers tune and many other Nintendo games. And he might even be the most played composer of the 80s and the 90s worldwide, and still nobody knows the guy. But what was his constraint? Well, you have to know that the sound generator chip used by Nintendo only allowed for 5 audio channels. In reality, that means that 5 sounds, musical or otherwise, could play at once. And nevertheless, the music had to be catchy and, let's say, not too annoying. And I think the composer managed this masterfully, even with these awful computer sounds that were provided by the sound generator. So Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest, Donkey Kong, and so many more. Even when you hear the first notes after 30 years, you will immediately recognize the music. And it's almost as if the constraints on the resources led to an increase in creativity. Let's go to a last example in the arts, and here we're talking about literature, and I'm sure some of you recognize this man. This is Ernest Hemingway, the famous American writer, who once tried to convince his friends that he could write a full story in only 6 words. So he wrote the legendary sentence, "For sale, baby shoes, never worn." 6 words, a whole story. And when I do a presentation in front of a live audience, I will always include this exercise of write your own 6-word story in 5 minutes time. And it's amazing what comes out of it sometimes. So I really recommend to try it once yourself. So why is it that constraints often stimulate creativity? In fact, there are 3 reasons. And the first one is that constraints are often a starting point. In other words, you know where to begin. It brings you in the flow to start a creative process. And even though it sounds strange, but giving people total freedom to fulfill a creative task is rather paralyzing. And in psychology, it's called the tyranny of choice. When there are no limitations, the options are infinite. So you can compare it with trying to order a dish in a restaurant when there are more than 100 dishes on the menu. That's really awful. There's always a fear of making the wrong choice. Like we say, choosing becomes losing. And the second reason is that constraints offer a kind of framework. Creating within a clearly defined box gives you a certain level of comfort. And if you're well aware of the area you can move in, you don't have to be constantly stressed to cross any forbidden borders, so you can fully concentrate on the creative process. And in many cases, these constraints can even be a muse or an inspiration for your creativity. For instance, imagine that you have to organize a party for your friends, but you are given a certain theme as a constraint. For instance, it should all be related to Italy, because you're going to do a trip to Italy with your friends. And in that case, Italy becomes your source of inspiration. You will probably provide Italian food. The music will be Italian. There can be an Italian dress code. You might even create some fun games based on Italian culture and history, etc. And the third reason is that really creative people, they love challenges. They want to be confronted so they can prove how creative they really are. And here you can compare it with a game. There's no fun in playing a game that is too easy. Think of computer games with different levels. To keep a game interesting, it needs a certain level of difficulty, of challenge. Because when you succeed in conquering that challenge, it will give you a feeling of pride and satisfaction. And you will be eager to play more. And the same happens with creative challenges. When there are enough constraints and obstacles, it keeps you focused and hungry for more. One of the main creative skills you have to use when dealing with constraints is thinking in alternatives. And this is a skill you really can develop by practicing a lot, and which makes the typical difference between a rational and a creative thinker. When you pose a question to a rational thinker, he will try to answer you as straightforward as possible. And straightforward implies giving you the logical answer, giving you the answer, the first that comes to mind almost instinctively, the one that has proven to be the right answer in many cases. And it will never come up to the mind of a rational thinker to question a logic answer. It's like everything is math to him. 1 + 1 is 2. That's final. And he's more than happy with that. Now, when you pose the same question to a creative thinker, something strange starts to happen in his brain. And of course, he also knows this answer that is considered as the most straightforward one, but he will not pronounce it because it doesn't satisfy him. He will start thinking for an alternative answer. And he also knows that there is not only one alternative, but there are many alternatives. So a process of coming up with alternative answers starts in his brain. That's what we call divergent thinking. And once he considers he has found enough alternatives, he makes a selection. Which of the alternatives is the most novel and useful for the question that has been posed? And perhaps he might even combine some of the alternatives to get a new alternative. Anyhow, he will not be satisfied until his answer will be different, but at least equally useful as a straightforward answer of the rational thinker. And that's what we call thinking in alternatives. So in many cases, when dealing with constraints or obstacles, you get forced to think in alternatives because the straightforward answer is blocked by an obstacle. And the more you're trained in thinking in alternatives, the easier and quicker you will get your alternative and creative solution. That's the reason why I always recommend to make creative thinking a mindset, because we have to deal with obstacles and constraints every day, as you know. For instance, imagine that you're a surgeon working in a hospital, but not any hospital. No, you work in a hospital in Ethiopia, in Africa, where there are only 3 doctors per 100,000 inhabitants. That means 1 doctor for 33,000 people. Talking about a constraint. But there's more. Because besides the huge lack of medically skilled people, there's also a lack of budget, of course, and hospital equipment is very expensive. So how do you deal with that? Let me introduce you to Erik Eriksson. He's a surgeon originally from Sweden, working in an Ethiopian hospital for many years now. He's 70 years old, and he doesn't think of retiring yet because the life of thousands of people depend on him and his small team. And what you see here is not a joke. He uses a $25 hand drill coming from the local do-it-yourself shop to operate his patients, because there is simply no money to buy a $4,000 surgical drill. And here's an overview of the rest of his equipment. So besides the hand drill, Eriksson also works with repair clamps to heal bone fractures. He works with fish thread for sewing wounds, and spokes from bicycle wheels to perform bone marrow aspirations. So when the box of money in this case is the limit, you're obliged to think in alternatives. And another example is from my home country, Belgium, where a young mother was confronted with the fact that she was too late applying for daycare, and so she couldn't find any place to drop off her children when she needed it. And a handful of other parents found themselves in the same situation. And so the search for a creative solution began, and together they created Kokido. And the basic concept is simple. In exchange for minding other people's children 1 day a week, the other 4 workdays your own children are taken care of by other participants. So the parents managed to make it work, and in no time this local project traveled to other cities in Belgium, and now it is a big success. So once again, a real constraint, in this case, not finding a place to drop off your children when you need it, led to a creative and very effective solution that has become a new and successful service. Nowadays, there are many examples of famous companies and brands that created a whole new market of constraints, and it seems to be a rule that the more radical the constraint, the more radical the solution. So what about creating a bookstore when you don't have a store? Amazon, of course. Or a vacuum cleaner without a dust bag? Dyson. And from the same manufacturer, a fan without blades. Or could you imagine 20 years ago a circus without animals? Cirque du Soleil. Or a hotel chain without hotels? Airbnb. Or a taxi company without vehicles? Uber. All these cases inspired me to create my first technique, which is called Tree of Trade. And in fact, it's a simple find and replace technique supported by a canvas that you see here and which you can download for free on the website that comes with my book. And I'll give you the appropriate info where to find it at the end of this webinar. So let's zoom in a bit on the canvas, but I think it works well if I give you a challenge right away. Suppose you want to start up a restaurant, but not just any kind of restaurant. No, you want to create a whole new concept, something that doesn't exist yet. Now, when you look at the bottom of the graph, you see the words missing essential. The purpose is to make a list of essential elements that are related to the subject of your challenge. And as we're talking here about a restaurant, let's list them up. So you surely need a venue to start with. You will also need a kitchen, of course, and in that kitchen you'll need a chef and a kitchen staff. You will need waiters to serve the food, and don't forget the food and drinks itself. You will need a menu, etc. So when you've finished your list, take out one element. Let's try the third element on the list, which is chef and kitchen staff. So you write it down on a sticky note and you put it on the canvas on top of the word missing element, like we do here. Now, when you go up in the graph, you see the words related need. This means which need does this essential element cover? I think in this case, it's quite clear. We need a chef and kitchen staff to prepare the food. So write it down and stick it on related need. Furthermore, you see 4 times the word alternative written in white on a red star. So this gives you the opportunity to find 4 alternatives, A, B, C, and D, that cover the specific need you just wrote down on that sticky note. And the reason why I put red stars instead of blue circles is to stimulate the user to come up with crazy ideas. So don't be too shy to use your imagination. That's the whole purpose. So with which alternatives can you come up with to prepare food if you don't have a chef and if you don't have a kitchen staff? So a first alternative could be the client himself prepares the food. Why not? Or it can be prepared by robots. Or even more crazy, we can train animals to prepare it. And a last alternative, we don't need anyone to prepare it because we only serve ready-made meals from the supermarket. So now we have our 4 alternatives. Now in the last stage, you see for each alternative 3 times the word translation. It means that the alternative you came up with might be just a little bit too crazy or too blurry to implement right away. So how are you going to translate it back to reality? How can you make it work? So 3 possibilities to translate the alternative. So let's pick out the first alternative. The client himself prepares the food. How can this be translated to a workable situation? Well, perhaps the client can prepare the food, his own food at home, and just bring it with him to the restaurant. Or he can use the kitchen of the restaurant and the ingredients can be provided by the restaurant itself. And in the kitchen, he has access to a library of instruction videos that will show him how to prepare different meals. So okay, I think we have already the base of a concept, and I pick out the last two translations and combine them. So what I get is, I will create a restaurant where the client prepares his own food with the ingredients and instructions provided by the restaurant. It's a kind of guided cook-it-yourself restaurant that seems quite original to me. And of course, this is only the basic idea. In the next step, you will further develop and fine-tune the concept alone or with other people. And I surely recommend not to stop at your first basic concept as we did now. Do it over with each of the alternatives, and then again, try it with each element on your list. Try it with venue, try it with kitchen, with waiters, etc. And you can do this all by yourself, but it will be much more fun and effective when you do with a small team. So download the canvas, print it out on a large format, and start your creative session. So far, the first technique, tree of trade. My second technique is some framing, and that's why I will talk about frugal innovation. Big companies spend billions and billions of dollars every year in R&D to create new products and services, and they work with highly schooled and skilled people, having all the latest technology and resources at their disposal. They operate from fancy buildings and laboratories containing all the equipment that they need. And this is in stark contrast to the circumstances in which people have to work who live in poorer countries. And I'm thinking of Africa, some parts of Asia or South America, the so-called developing countries. In these countries, these developing countries, economical conditions are harsh and they don't have big budgets to work with. There is no R&D labs, or there's no high-tech equipment and no skilled people with technical or business schooling. But even more than here in the West, they are in need of innovation, products, services that make their life easier. And most of the rich countries and companies, they are not really interested in that market because there is no money. So when it comes to innovation, they have to be self-supporting. But out of all these poor circumstances and constraints, something very creative comes out of it. They innovate with the things that are at hand for a large group of people who have no money, or at least not very much money. And that's what is called frugal innovation. So let me show you a few examples quickly. What you see here is a refrigerator, and this fridge is not running on electricity. It's entirely made of clay, and by pouring water into the top, this refrigerator can easily keep vegetables, fruits, meat, whatever, fresh for several days. So there's no technology or expensive materials involved. So people can buy it for no more than $40. And also the Indian designer of the fridge is not driven by profit. He has only one goal, that's to make a very useful product available for a large number of people. Another beauty is this one. In Lima, in Peru, there are long periods without rain, so the availability of drinkable water is a serious problem. And strange enough, there's a high humidity, which means there's a lot of invisible water in the air. And the billboard you see on the picture absorbs that water from the air and turns it into drinkable water. And the system can produce about 90 liters of water per day. I'm pleased to say that in recent years, we see more and more people in our Western world who also design and market frugal products out of social engagement. An American guy, for instance, named Kenton Lee, he was struck by the fact that millions of children in poor countries don't have any decent shoes to wear. And that's not only a question of comfort, but even more so, one of health. Children walking barefoot often get injured by sharp objects, or they get infected by parasites. And with the poor medical treatment in those countries, they sometimes die from these injuries or infections. And of course, the additional challenge is that children grow fast and need new shoes almost every year. So he designed these particular shoes. And like you see here, it's a kind of open sandal that is adaptable easily. So the shoe literally grows with a kid and can be worn about 5 years long. And up till today, more than 150 shoes have been distributed by 1,000 partners in almost 100 countries. There's also a growing number of customers for frugally innovative solutions in the West. And one of the examples is the success of the cheap Logan race of Dacia, a sub-brand of the French car manufacturer Renault. And it starts at 5,000 euro, which is, of course, very cheap for a quality car. And they succeeded to keep the price so low by stripping it down to the essential features, but not giving up on quality. So frugal innovation is the source of the second technique I like to present to you, and which is called the frugalizer. So by reading and analyzing many frugal stories, I came to the conclusion that there are a number of mechanisms that always seem to come back. And I selected 12 of these mechanisms and made them the core of my technique. Let me quickly present 4 of them as an illustration. Okay, the one here, the first one with the trash can, for instance, is called defeaturing. And it's exactly what Renault did with his Logan range cars, namely stripping down by eliminating as many features and elements as you can. Or there's a mechanism called user raising, literally raising the number of users by targeting as many user groups or user profiles for your subject as possible. We also have localizing, which means focusing on using more local products, local resources, local services. And the fourth example is the icon with the strong arm, which is robusting. It's about coming up with ideas how to make your subject more robust, more durable, more reliable. And again, this technique is free to use and can be downloaded on the website. It comes with an instruction sheet, a canvas, and the 12 mechanisms printed on a kind of tent cards. And you can use this technique for a broad kind of applications, but in particular, if you consider making your subject more frugal, which means more available and affordable for a large group of people with limited budget and resources. So let me quickly explain how it works. Participants are sitting around a table and you divide them into a group. It can be a group of 2, 3, 4 more people, depending on the number of participants. So let's take 3 groups of 3 people here. And in front of each group, you place a different tent card with one of the 12 specific mechanisms that I explained. You tell them how much time they got to come up with as many ideas as possible for the specific mechanism, and you start the clock. So ideally, it should be somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. So they start writing down their ideas on sticky notes as soon as the clock starts. When the clock stops and they have written down all their ideas, you give each team another tent card with a different mechanism, start the clock again, and let them come up with new ideas based on the new frugal mechanism. Clock stops, a new tent card, new ideas, and last time, so all the 12 frugal mechanisms have been treated. Next thing to do is to collect all the ideas, eventually make a selection and stick them to the frugalizer canvas with their respective mechanisms. Then you pick out the very best ideas, and just like for the first technique, Tree of Trade, you will further develop and fine-tune the ideas into concepts with your team. So far, the second technique, the frugalizer, again, freely downloadable from the website, of which I will give you the address at the end of this webinar. One important constraint we didn't talk about yet is time. So what about time constraints? Is it a friend or is it a foe of creativity? And the answer is, as you might have guessed, it's not a simple yes or no. It mainly depends on 3 parameters. First of all, on the kind of task or work that has to be done. Is it perceived as meaningful or not? And research has shown that the more meaningful a task is perceived, the more it stimulates creativity. And that should be, of course, not a surprise. Secondly, it depends on the intensity of the time pressure. Is it rather high or low? And again, based on research, a high to medium time pressure stimulates creativity as long as the work is perceived as being meaningful. So the first parameter also has to be fulfilled. And thirdly, it depends on the creative confidence of the person that undergoes time constraints. I have to be honest, this one has not been scientifically researched as far as I know, but it comes from my own experience as of many years in business creativity. So creative confidence means believing in your own creative potential. In other words, to what measure is a person confident that he can rely on his creativity to solve a problem or to tackle a challenge? And this confidence can be trained, and the more you use your creativity, the quicker it will grow. Or working in a stimulating team can also boost your creative confidence. So my personal experience says that people with a high creative confidence can carry more time pressure than people with a low creative confidence. The casual constraint is the third technique I like to present you. In fact, it's a game, a competition based on random constraint scenarios and time pressure. So the first element is a set of cards containing more than 100 scenarios that will oblige you to think within a certain constraint situation. The second element is the fact that you get a limited amount of time, a deadline, to come up with as many ideas as possible. Concretely, maximum 10 minutes for 3 scenarios, but I'll tell you more about that later. And the third element is the team competition. As I said, it's a game, a competition, but you're always playing it with at least one partner, which will automatically push your creative confidence. And in the end, there's a final winner. So let's move over to see how it works. So it's definitely a team game. So you put the participants around the table. And of course, the first thing you need is a challenge. I recently facilitated the game for a European newspaper, so I'll take this as an example. And like with any other newspaper, year after year, the number of paying readers is declining. So they wanted to come up with creative ideas how to revamp, to reboost their newspaper to attract more readers. So the challenge, put simply, is save the newspaper. As with many games, there are colored pawns, and in this case, only the colors red, yellow, and blue, who are equally distributed amongst the participants. And also a colored die will determine how the teams are formed. And I will not get into details how it works exactly, but this is all explained clearly in the instruction sheet that comes with the game. The pile of cards with the constraint scenarios is put in the middle of the table, and each team picks 3 cards blindly. And they get 10 minutes of time, and now it's the purpose to come up with as many ideas as possible for the challenge. In this case, save the newspaper, but within the scenario that is mentioned on each of the cards. And let me show you some samples of constraint cards. These are all scenarios that start with words what if. For instance, what if it's too slow and you need to make it faster? In our case of the newspaper, it might be not so obvious, perhaps a faster delivery or bringing the newspaper faster. How you interpret each card is completely up to the team. Second sample, what if your product becomes a service or a service becomes a product? Nice one, I think. How can you make the newspaper a service instead of a product? What if you should make a version of it for a target group of elderly people? Also relevant for the challenge. Or what if computers have become illegal? Perhaps less obvious in this case. Or what if none of your clients could read or write? Now, that's a challenging one. Or what if it has to be fully future-proof? Not so easy as well for a newspaper. Or what if you're asked to make a toy version of it? Also challenging. Or what if you cannot use any of the same tools, materials, or processes you've used before to create it, which is also a tough one. So you notice that some scenarios are quite obvious, while others are more challenging, or some are even not possible or irrelevant to the challenge. As a team, you decide if you want to keep your 3 cards or if you want to replace one or more by another card on the pile. Just be aware that per card you replace, you lose 1 minute. So if, for instance, if you change 2 of your 3 cards, you only have 8 minutes left to come up with ideas. Keep in mind that you receive 1 point per idea, but if for one scenario you have less than 3 ideas, you will lose 10 points. That's the rule. And the points per team are calculated and divided equally amongst the team members, and then we can start all over again. With a color die, new teams will be formed, and together you decide how many rounds you will play, and just like with the other techniques, in the very end you select the best ideas and develop them into beautiful concepts. That's in brief the casual constraint contest. Now, let's go back in time a bit, not until the birth of the Earth, of course, but until April 13, 1970, to be exact. And I guess you all heard these famous words in one way or another. Houston, we have a problem. And sure, they had a big problem. We're talking about the mission of Apollo 13, the third manned mission to the moon. And here you see the crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. And during their mission on the moon, there was a serious incident. One of the two oxygen tanks exploded. So the astronauts had to abort their mission and come back to the Earth as quick as possible. But to do so, they were forced to move from the mission module to the lunar module. And the biggest problem, however, was the removal of nitrogen in the lunar module. So to do so, a filter piece had to be used from the mission module, but that piece didn't fit on the part of the moon module. So briefly said, they had to fit a round tube into a square box. And that's what you see here on the picture on top. So ground control took over, and a number of engineers tried to tackle the problem together. And of course, the clock was ticking because with every minute, the level of nitrogen rose significantly. So they made a list of all the materials aboard the lunar module. They collected them, and they spread them out on the table. And that's what you see on the picture below. And by the way, both pictures are not the real picture from 1970, but screenshots from the movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks, which was made 30 years later, of course. Anyway, they started playing around with these materials, and after less than an hour, they came up with a solution. They constructed a box of duct tape of spare parts from spacesuits and tube socks, and afterwards, the construction of the box, which they jokingly called the mailbox, was communicated to the astronauts, and miraculously, they managed to copy it precisely. So here you're looking at the real outcome. It's not exactly an example of sleek design, but it worked, and that, of course, was the only purpose. And 3 days later, Apollo 13 landed safely back on Earth. So why am I telling you this story? Well, first of all, to show you that under time pressure, creativity gets boosted, especially when people work together. Secondly, that even with the most random things that are at hand, you sometimes can build a solution that fits the demand. But I think we have already discussed both observations previously. There's a third observation, and I'm sure everyone you can relate to it. It's often so much easier to see solutions for other people's problems than for your own. It's like we're in a maze of our own problem. We only see obstacles, and every solution seems to have a limitation. You would like to be lifted up to see where the exit is. And that's why other people standing outside or on top of your maze are better placed to see the solution for you. And what helps is to ask yourself the why question over and over again. Why are these obstacles on my path? And what do they withhold? It's a very analytical way to look at the problem, which allows you to go beyond the emotional barriers. And that knowledge brings us to the fourth technique, which is called the propeller. First of all, this technique allows you to go deeper into the core of your problem by asking you the why question. And secondly, it will lift you up by showing you one or more exits. So let's get to zoom into the canvas to quickly explain what it means. So what you see here is a silhouette of a propeller with 3 blue wings. First thing to do is to define your constraint. You have your standing in your way. So you write that constraint on a post-it and stick it in the middle of your canvas. Then you will ask yourself, why is it a constraint? What does it withhold? In which way does it restrict what? And there may be more than one reason. That's why the canvas foresees 3 blue areas with the letter A, each one on the wing of a propeller. So you write each reason why it is a constraint on a separate post-it and stick it in that blue area. Great, now let's concentrate on one wing, the one on top. Later on, you can do the same for the other 2 wings. So we ask the why question once again. So we dig deeper into the real problem. The reason you wrote on your post-it and sticked on the blue area with the letter A, why is it a constraint? What does it withhold, or in which way does it restrict what? Again, you write the answer on a post-it and stick it in the blue area defined by the letter B. And we do it over again. Why is that new reason a constraint? We dig deeper again and again. We write it down, stick it on the blue area defined by the letter C, and we continue deepening the answer more and more to the areas D and E. So don't worry, you're not obliged to go all the way to E. When you finish with C or D, you probably did a great job already. Now, in the next phase of the technique, we try to find our way out of the maze. We start on level A and look again at the answer we have given. Now, instead of asking the why question, we try to find a solution. How can we encounter this constraint? Or how can this issue be solved alternatively? So it's time to use your creativity. Try to come up with a crazy idea. Don't worry if it's realistic or not. Just anything that pops up in your head. It's important to be aware of that, because don't restrict yourself. Write that crazy idea on a post-it and stick it in the greenish area defined by A1, like I've done. And because it's a crazy idea, chances are low that it will be applicable right away. So don't worry. That's why we have the areas A2, A3, A4, etc. to fine-tune the idea and make it more realistic and applicable in the real world. So with every step you take, it's closer to the stage of applicability. So we do the same for the constraints in the other areas, B and C. And in the end, we have plenty of ideas to choose from. So that's the propeller. It's not the easiest technique, I confess, but it demands quite some openness and creativity. But I have to admit that it's one of my favorites, and you definitely have to try it out. We have been talking about thinking in alternatives, about frugal innovation, about time constraints, and other random scenarios to stimulate creativity. But there are still some other ways to face constraints and obstacles. And one of them is open innovation. And I'm not going into too much detail because it's a specialty on its own, but nevertheless, open innovation can be considered as a great way to counter constraints of many kinds. Mostly when companies start an innovation process, they will do it internally. They don't want third parties to be involved because of the risk that a competitor could take advantage of their innovation efforts and steal their ideas. But an innovation process can be huge. It goes from research to implementation, from creative potential to the capacity to develop innovative ideas and to test, adjust, and implement them. So to successfully complete all these steps, an organization needs a lot of resources. But not everyone, and certainly not all the smaller organizations or companies, have this arsenal of weapons to do it on their own. So metaphorically speaking, you need a big toolbox to build a house all by yourself. So to face the internal limitations and constraints, more and more companies find a way to open innovation. And continuing on our metaphor, we could say, if you don't have all the tools in your own toolbox, don't be too proud to borrow what you need from your neighbors. The main idea is that in our present world, where creativity, knowledge, and skills are so widespread, we can't afford to only depend on our own internal capabilities. Moreover, we're living in a transparent world nowadays where protectionism and intellectual property are issues that are fading out very fast. Also, many companies realize that true innovation is about a long-term vision. And with that in mind, they are not afraid to look for win-win agreements with different partners around the world. So in my opinion, open innovation has a bright future. And again, there's a lot of good literature on the market that goes way deeper than what I'm presenting about it here. Yet another way to deal with constraints is not trying to fight it, but on the contrary, to accept it and make it a benefit. And the first step, of course, is to recognize there is a constraint and trying to define it as accurate as possible. The second step is to find a way how to make it a benefit, perhaps even your best quality or your unique selling proposition. And I'll give you a couple of examples that are really splendid. Here you see a hotel in Amsterdam, and it's called the Hans Brinker Hotel. It's a low-budget hotel, mainly focused on youngsters. The hotel used to get terrible ratings from their guests. The rooms were dirty, the service was bad, it was noisy, there was no privacy, etc., etc. Now, you can do two things about it. Either you can say, okay, I'll get it. I will do my best to give a better service, to clean up the rooms more often, to provide more privacy, etc. But chances are that it will result in a higher cost or more effort. Or you can say, I don't care about the complaints. It's a very low budget hotel and people have to accept as it comes. Or even stronger, what Hans Brinker did was using these terrible complaints as a unique quality. And they hired a very creative agency to help them with that. And during the years, the agency made a series of different campaigns that are really hilarious. For instance, this one. They claimed that the hotel was eco-friendly, but not on purpose. No, it was accidentally eco-friendly. Like on the left poster, where they call the stairs an eco-elevator. Or on the right poster, where the curtains have become eco-towels. There was another campaign wherein they showed a person before and after check-in. And just the contrary of how it should be, of course, but very funny indeed. And this is just one of them. I think they made 4 or 5 variations of it. Or this one, a very sarcastic approach of their lousy service and the lack of comfort and privacy. And as you notice, the way they deal with this is with tons of humor. And a good dose of humor or self-mockery always works in advertising. And it's not a new concept because it has been used decades before by other brands from other industries. When Volkswagen launched their Beetle model in the late 50s in America, they had quite some constraints to face. First of all, it was a very small and a very ugly car compared to the American vehicles like Cadillac, Chevrolet, Buick, etc. And secondly, it was a German car. And a couple of years after the Second World War, Germany was still related to the Nazi regime and the terrible person of Adolf Hitler. And by the way, the Beetle was built in the late 30s, commissioned by Hitler himself. So you see, quite a lot of constraints to conquer. But they didn't fight these constraints. No, Volkswagen used a lot of humor and self-mockery. Like you can see here in some newspaper advertisements from the late 50s. The Think Small campaign on the left was really a big success, and this self-mockery attitude comes out well on the ad on the right, where it says, if you run out of gas, it's easy to push. So it's time to present you the last technique I will show in this webinar, and it's called the river. And this technique uses the metaphor of a river to approach a constraint or an obstacle. So imagine you're running through the woods from point A, which is your starting point, to point B, which is your target. And all in all, suddenly a wild river crosses your path. What will you do? What are your options? And giving up is not one of them. So let's have a closer look at the 6 options I propose in this technique. The first one, you can swim the river. And swimming the river is a metaphor to let you think about if you're able to conquer or to control the obstacle with power, with energy, authority, with drive or influence. Do you have everything you need for this, or can you count on the help of others? Or you can bridge the river. That's the second one. Constructing a bridge across the river means that you have the skills, the materials, and the insight to overpass the obstacle. Can you construct a smart connection? And again, do you have everything you need for this, or can you count on the help of others? That's bridging. Now, the third option is to block the river. It means, can you prevent the obstacle to hinder your ambition by putting an end to it, deactivate it, or disarm it? And can this be done permanently or just for a short period of time? And again, can you do this on your own, or do you need partners for that? Option number 4 is bypassing the river. Do you have the time, the patience, and the lean mindset to metaphorically walk around the obstacle? Is there any chance the obstacle will be less prominent under certain circumstances or at a specific point in time? That's bypassing. And the fifth one is sailing the river, sorry. This refers to your flexibility to go with the flow. Can you initially accept the obstacle and go along with it to see where it will take you? Are you able to adapt your actions while never losing sight of your goal? It's about taking risks, being opportunistic, and change your plans regularly. And the last one is what I showed you in the examples of Volkswagen and the Hans Brinker Hotel. Can you fish the river? Do you have the smart and creative mindset to accept the river and take the best out of it? Have you considered that not the initial targets you had in mind, but the obstacle itself might be your ultimate goal or your answer? Can you not only accept the obstacle, but also embrace it as a true advantage, the USP you were looking for? And are you crazy and creative enough to make it happen? Then you can go fishing. I do realize that some of the methods might sound a bit blurry or abstract to you now, but that's the whole purpose. How you interpret them is up to you, and it will also tickle your creativity. And some methods might even be overlapping with others, but that's okay. The purpose for this and for any other technique is to come up with as many ideas as possible, regardless from which stimulus they came originally. So we have come to the end of my webinar and my presentation, wherein I presented to you 5 different techniques and how you can use constraints to drive your creativity. The frugalizer, based on the mechanisms of frugal innovation. Tree of trades, where we look for alternatives that replace essential elements of your challenge. The propeller, a technique that lifts you up to take you out of the maze and forces you to approach a challenge in a very analytical way. The casual constraint contest, it's a team game based on what-if scenarios, competition, and time constraints. And the last but not least, the river, which is a metaphorical approach to your challenge, giving you 6 ways to solve it. Now, here is the website where you can find all the tools that come with the techniques I showed you. You can go to whentheboxisthelimit.com, and then you click on the techniques area, which will lead you to the download area for each technique. I want to underline you that you're not obliged to purchase the book that comes with it, and neither do you have to register it on the website. I'd be happy, and feel free to do so, of course, but the downloads of the tools are 100% free, and they will remain so. When you use one or more techniques, you can share your experience in the community, where, of course, you can also learn from other people. So I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And of course, I hope you also learned something that you can actually use in your professional or personal life next time you face an obstacle or a constraint. So don't hesitate to contact with me on LinkedIn if you didn't do so already, or send me a mail about everything that concerns the content of this webinar. And if you'd like me to come and speak for your organization or your event, your seminar, etc., you can, of course, hire me as a keynote speaker. And I do so in English, maar ook in het Nederlands. Et même en français, je me débrouille. So a keynote presentation can also be combined, or not, with a workshop where people can actually try out the different techniques in smaller groups, assisted by my facilitators who will professionally help you and your team to come up with creative ideas based on different constraints. Or perhaps you want to become a trainer or a facilitator yourself. And in that case, please register on the website, because soon I will start organizing trainings to certify people as a trainer/facilitator. So reasons enough to stay in contact. And as I promised, I will try to send you all an email soon with the answers you post during this webinar. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. This webinar will also soon be available on my YouTube page, so you can watch it again or share it with anyone who might be interested. Thank you once again, and remember, when you can't find the solution within the box, you probably haven't checked all the corners. Have a wonderful day and a life full of creativity. Bye-bye.